Good morning, everyone. It is Thursday, March the 5th, 2020. It is currently 11:07 a.m. Central Time. I'm coming to you live here at Victory Baptist Church. We are located in Ovalo, Texas. I always joke that's the middle of nowhere, but I say that joke all the time, so it's probably not funny anymore. Yes, I'm coming to you live from Victory Baptist Church located in Ovalo, Texas. And I am hesitating mentioning the subject we're going to be talking about today. Now, if you got the notification on your device that we are going live, you saw the title. If you're listening to a recording of this, obviously you saw the title. But the reason I'm hesitating is because I don't feel qualified to speak on this subject. I don't feel like I have enough knowledge to speak on this subject. However, I feel that I need to speak about it because of a recent article. I think this was published in Christianity Today. And so it's being talked about. I did a little research, did some searching, and it seems that this is a topic that has been discussed a lot. And to be honest with you, I've never really paid much attention to it. I think we've probably all been there. There's always these topics that we hear about. Maybe we see an article, we don't really read it. We hear about it and we're kind of like, whatever, not really going to pay attention to that. And then the next thing we know, oh wait, this is a big subject. Why was I ignoring it? And this is how I feel about this subject. I've heard about it. I've seen articles about it, but I've never really sat down to read it. I've never really sat down to pay much attention to it. I've never given it much thought. I've never given it much consideration. And it seems it's at least a serious issue in the minds and the eyes of many people. Now, I'm not saying it's not a serious issue. I'm saying that in the minds of many people, it's a serious issue. I've never perceived it as a serious issue. So this is a situation where I'm approaching it kind of from the outside looking in. I'm going to try to offer a fair perspective on this subject. And maybe by the time I'm done considering it, I too will see it as a very serious issue that everyone needs to spend a lot of time thinking about and considering. I right now, I just don't have enough knowledge for me to really understand how serious, sometimes you need knowledge to be able to determine the severity of something. Ignorance is not the position to start judging how serious something is or isn't. You have to gain all the facts. You have to gain all the knowledge. And I think what makes this situation very difficult is it going to come down to, and this is a very important word, definition. Definition. We're going to need a specific, definitive definition before we can identify the problem and then before we can judge the seriousness of it. And it seems that there's a lot of disagreement on definitions, all right? So this is how we're going to do this. We're going to approach this. Well, we'll approach this with you understanding that I'm not the expert and that my knowledge on this subject is extremely limited. So we're going to approach this like we're going to introduce this topic. We're going to introduce the topic. I've got some news articles here. I've got some thoughts. I've got a Bible passage here that came to mind when I was thinking about this. And we'll just kind of introduce this with the idea that we probably need to come back to this subject at some later time. And a lot of that, again, a lot of what I talk about is determined by you, the listener. If you reach out, you email, you talk to me, you tell me, you give me feedback. You're telling me, you're engaging in conversation. That can lead to additional programs on a subject. That can lead to me turning a completely different direction. So you really control a lot of this, and you can always send your feedback to me at newsif@yahoo.com. Newsif@yahoo.com. All right, I've been vague enough. What we're going to talk about today is the subject of spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse. And what I found interesting is when I first started doing some research on this idea of spiritual abuse, I kept being led to websites that dealt with, domestic violence, abuse within the home. And they would talk about how to know you're being spiritually abused by your partner. And here are the signs that your partner in your home, it's your husband, your wife, your parents, whatever, how you are being the victim of spiritual abuse. And I've never even thought of it from that perspective. I've never even considered it. And how big a problem is it? Now, I want you to think about this. You can see how this is just a very, just when we consider it from let's do this. So there seems to be two perspectives. There is a spiritual abuse that happens within the home, all right? And that can be, I guess, from husband to wife to husband, partner to partner, parent to child, which opens up all kinds of doors that I don't know if anyone wants to go into, but we're gonna try to be fair and balanced here, and we're gonna try to not avoid a subject because it makes us uncomfortable. So we will go there at some point. So there's the first issue when it comes to spiritual abuse that takes place in the home, and then the second place where you'll find articles talking about it is spiritual abuse within the church. So spiritual abuse within the home and spiritual abuse within the church. Now, of course, we need a good working definition. And it seems in most cases there isn't agreed upon definition of what is spiritual abuse. So what they do is they provide you like a list. Here are the 10 signs of spiritual abuse in your home. Here are the 10 signs of spiritual abuse within your church. And you read some of those signs and you're like, whoa, wait a minute. That could apply to almost anything, because sometimes they're written in a way that you could kind of put a lot of situations. You could fit a lot of things into that situation, therefore saying that you were spiritually abused. So this is dangerous ground, because if you're not careful, then you're going to say, hey, all of these actions are spiritual abuse, and you're going to have all kinds of people saying, well, then I was abused, and my church is abusive, and my husband is abusive, or my wife is abusive, or kids are going to be saying, oh, my parents are abusive. So we don't want to. We got to define this, is what I'm trying to say. We have to define this. But we'll start this way. I'm just going to. So understand there are two categories: spiritual abuse in the home, spiritual abuse in the church. We'll turn our attention first to spiritual abuse in the church. And we're going to do so because I have a number of articles here talking about this subject. And I'm going to start with the most recent one, which is from Christianity Today. And this is what sparked this entire discussion, this entire idea to hit the go live button, even though I'm not completely prepared for this, because I don't even know where to start. I don't even know. So we're going to start with the article that I saw that sparked all of this, that started all of this, that motivated all of this. And we'll use that to kind of flesh out this idea, to try to build almost a skeleton, at least, of what spiritual abuse is, what it isn't, some of the problems with trying to define it, and then we'll try to flesh it out a little bit. Hopefully we can accomplish this, all right? And I am purposely trying to let you hear my hesitation, my struggle with trying to figure this out. I want you to hear my struggle. I want you to hear my hesitancy. I want you to hear me pausing and stumbling over my words, because I believe that if we got a bunch of Christians together and we started talking about spiritual abuse, we would find that a lot of people would have a hard time identifying it, and you would have some who would become very upset, especially spiritual parents. If, Christian parents, if you brought their kids in and are like, yeah, I was spiritually abused in my home, they'd be like, wait, no. And they would be very upset and hurt that they would be identified as that. And there would be many pastors, if you brought in people from their church and saying, yes, you spiritually abused me, they would be hurt and they would push back. And so I think when you open up when you throw out a subject like this, I want you to feel that it should make all of us a little bit like, well, wait a minute. Okay, what do you mean by that? Okay, wait, that makes me uncomfortable. Wait, are you calling me a spiritual abuser? Wait, are you telling me my church is spiritually abusive? Wait, how? And I think we would all struggle to articulate, to define, to know exactly what it is, exactly what it isn't, how big of a problem it is. So I want you to hear me struggle and try to think this through, because I want it to mirror your own internal struggle with trying to process this, because I think that's going to be the reality. I really do. I think that's going to be the reality. And maybe these articles will capture some of this. So let's go to the first one. This comes to us from ChristianityToday.com. I don't have a date here. I first saw it yesterday, and I immediately saved it to my notes on my iPad because I knew I wanted to talk about this, all right? Spiritual abuse definition debated by UK Christians. Spiritual abuse definition debated by UK Christians. So in the United Kingdom, there is a debate amongst Christians on defining what spiritual abuse is. So the very first headline captures what I'm trying to in an audio form, I'm trying to let you feel. My hesitancy, my struggle, my stumbling over words, that's what's happening in the UK. You've got Christians trying to figure, what is spiritual abuse? That's not spiritual abuse. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. I was abused. No, you weren't. Yes, I was. Okay. That's a difficult situation. All right. Now, they name some names here, and I may not know how to pronounce these, so I will, one of these I may not. This is how this preview paragraph. It says, the headline is Spiritual Abuse Definition Debated by UK Christians. And then underneath that, we read these words. Cases of Steve Timmis, Timmis, if I'm mispronouncing that, I apologize. Cases of Steve Timmis and Jonathan Fletcher illustrate debate over at what point a pastor's exhortation crosses the line into coercion. Now, this is the thing. There's these two cases of these two individuals, Steve Timmis and Jonathan Fletcher, and it illustrates a debate over at what point a pastor's exhortation crosses the line into coercion, where you're trying to coerce someone into doing someone. So when is it exhortation and when is it coercion? Well, wow, that's a good question. You know, I sit there and when I read that headline, I'm like, well, I'm a pastor. I exhort people, but have I ever tried to coerce someone into doing something? Was I guilty of spiritual abuse? When do you cross that line? And how do you understand, did Jesus spiritually abuse people in the temple? Did John the Baptist spiritually abuse people when he, called them all kinds of names? Did Jesus spiritually abuse the Pharisees and the Sadducees when he says some harsh things about them? Did Paul spiritually abuse people? Like when you read some passages in the New Testament, you're like, whoa, those are some strong rebukes. Those are harsh. Those are blunt. Those are direct. Those almost sound threatening. Is that spiritual abuse? Is this a subject where, now listen to me, is this a subject, when we think of spiritual abuse, is this a subject where, and I hate to use this terminology, but maybe this will at least put this in some kind of put this in a category that we can understand. And I'm not using this language because I necessarily want to, but I think it may be necessary. Is the subject of spiritual abuse a one where if you are, quote, a liberal progressive church, then you are all concerned about spiritual abuse, how it's happening in families, how it's happening in churches. And you become an advocate for speaking out against spiritual abuse. We're going to expose it, we're going to condemn it, and we're going to change the culture of the church. But if you're conservative Christian, again, I'm using this terminology, liberal conservative, because people understand this. if you are a conservative, fundamental, stand for the truth kind of church, we're going to fight for the truth, we're going to fight for doctrine, we're going to fight for theology, you think spiritual abuse is just something made up by liberals based off a culture that's become soft and they're whiny and they complain about everything. Now, this is always the danger. This issue could be a real serious issue, but it becomes connected to right versus left, liberal versus conservative, and so everything goes to extremes when there could be a reality that needs to be talked about by everyone. Because when you start getting into an argument, is that exhortation or is that coercion? That just screams at me like, whoa, wait a minute. Anytime a pastor gets up there and rebukes the church, which you're called to do, wait, that's spiritual abuse. Is that where this is going to go? I think this has some serious implications that every Christian needs to consider. But let's read the rest of this. All right, we're not getting very far. All right. Last month, the board of Acts 29, it's a ministry. Last month, the board of Acts 29 voted to remove Steve Timmis, again, Timmis, as CEO of the Global Church Planting Network, following an investigation into his abusive leadership. Timmis then resigned as the elder of the Crowded House, I guess in Sheffield, England, where he was also, I believe that's England, where he was also accused of spiritual abuse. So there was an investigation. He was removed as the CEO of Acts 29, which is a global church planting network, and then he resigned as the elder of Crowded House. Crowded House, not the band from the 80s, but okay, but I guess from a church. All right, that's kind of a weird name. The Crowded House. Maybe it's a ministry. It's an elder. It sounds like a church. He was accused of spiritual abuse there as well. So abusive leadership, and then resigned as elder because he was accused of spiritual abuse. So this is a serious thing. This is affecting ministries. This is affecting churches. The allegations and subsequent fallout highlight an ongoing debate over the nature and extent of spiritual abuse in evangelical churches in the United Kingdom. At issue is how to define the controversial phrase, how to determine its limits and scope, and how to appropriately prevent and address it. Now, please note, here are the issues at hand. Are you ready? Here we go. Here are the issues at hand. Number one, how to define spiritual abuse. How do we define it? Number two, how to determine its limits and scope. When you define it, then how do you determine the limit and scope of what that definition can apply to? And how to appropriately prevent it and address it. How do we prevent spiritual abuse? How do we address spiritual abuse? And it seems spiritual abuse is something a pastor could do that warrants being removed from the office of pastor. It sounds like spiritual abuse, according to some ministries, is grounds for removal, for termination, for being fired, for being told to go somewhere else. Now, let me just look really quick. This becomes I'm gonna save this passage right here. I got 1 Peter open, but let me go. You know where I'm going. You probably already turning there if you have an open Bible. Let's go to the passage that everyone says gives the qualifications for a pastor, for a bishop, for an overseer. 1 Timothy chapter 3. This is a true saying: if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. All right. Now, please note it says a man. All right. Seems to require there would be a man. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker. All right, that may apply. Not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous, one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into condemnation of the devil. Moreover, we must have a good report of them which are without, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. All right, there are the qualifications. Now, when you look at those qualifications, please note, you can probably find something because they just kind of give a general idea. They don't get very specific about every detail. Obviously, you could find some of those things and say that connects to spiritual abuse. That connects to spiritual abuse. You have to. Those definitions are there, and people can use them to probably find something that every pastor would be guilty of somewhere, somehow. They could probably be blameless. They could find one thing that the pastor could be blamed for and say he's not blameless, therefore he can be removed. So it's always, 1 Timothy 3 is a weapon. On one hand, it's a guide to hopefully help protect a church and hopefully keep the right person behind the pulpit, but it also can become a tool and a weapon used to get rid of anyone a church doesn't like. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in how that is used. So does 1 Timothy 3 give us a clear understanding of what spiritual abuse is? No, not a striker, not a brawler. Okay. What does that mean? What does that mean? How do you relate that? How do you relate that to the idea of spiritual abuse? See, I think sometimes when we bring in a term, spiritual abuse, and this is the grounds that a pastor can be terminated, and we don't even really have a biblical definition of it, this becomes very difficult in how this should impact the church. But this person resigned, terminated. This is obviously a serious issue. Let's see what else we can find here, all right? So there's an ongoing debate on how to, we read that again, how to define it, how to determine its limits and scope, and how to appropriately prevent and address it. Now, this is an interesting statistic. In 2017, more than 1,000 British Christians reported being victims or survivors of spiritual abuse. So in 2017, more than 1,000 British Christians reported being victims or survivors of spiritual abuse. This is reported in a study by churches. Now, this is an interesting group. It's CCPAS, Churches Child Protection Advisory Service. Churches Child Protection Advisory Service. That just sounds, wait a minute. So now is this dealing with the abuse of children in the church and not physical abuse, but spiritual abuse of children in the church? This is a UK Christian safeguarding charity now known as 31/8. Now, this group just sounds it's a little concerning there because, again, what do you mean by spiritual abuse? Think about it. If you're a child raised in Christianity, then guess what you are taught? There is a heaven, there is a hell. Someone who doesn't believe in Jesus will go to hell after they die and burn forever. A large portion of our society today would label that as psychological abuse. Is that spiritual abuse? Many kids are raised in a Christian home with very strict rules about what they can watch, what they can listen to, what they can wear, where they can go, what they can do. Is that spiritual abuse within the home? You see, this just, I want to make it very clear. I am not discounting the reality of spiritual abuse. What I'm struggling with is how to define it, because if we don't have a good definition, I think what you're getting, that where I'm leading you or where I'm trying to get you to is to realize, this could open the door for a lot of problems. Now, again, I'm not in the UK. So listeners in the UK could probably help, tell me a little bit more about this group, a little bit how, 1,000 people there claiming that they were abused. Is this a common subject in the UK about spiritual abuse? Is it talked about? Do all the churches in the UK know about this? Do they do things to try to prevent it? I mean, is this how big a deal is this in the UK? And right here in America, you may say, well, that's over there in the UK. Well, it always comes here sooner or later. It will show up here. This is using language. Listen to me. This is using language that sounds very 2020, very much a part of our culture today about abuse, and again, there are always people who take the subject and then go left or right with it and go to extremes. There's always, we got to find the middle. We got to be in the middle. We got to find balance, and we have to find truth. I think this idea of spiritual abuse is something that needs to be discussed, but we have to understand that it's also opening the door for, how many churches could be accused of spiritual abuse? How many Christian parents could be accused of spiritual abuse? And does this become something that is then prosecuted by the law? Could your kids be taken away because you were accused of spiritual abuse? I'm not saying we're going to be there tomorrow. I'm just saying this seems to be a very interesting approach. I mean, go back 20 years ago. Was there a discussion about spiritual abuse? Maybe there was, but I think this is something to watch out for. But let's see what they say here. So in 2017, more than 1,000 British Christians reported being victims or survivors of spiritual abuse in a study by CCPAS, Churches Child Protection Advisory Service. It's a UK Christian safeguarding charity known as 31/8 now. Even so, the co-authors of the report, Lisa Oakley, associate professor at the University of Chester, and Justin Humphreys, CEO at 31/8, acknowledge the term spiritual abuse is currently contentious. So the ones who did that study, the ones who authored it, they admit that the term spiritual abuse is currently contentious. Yes, I would say it's contentious because you can't go around accusing people of something if you don't have a clear definition of it. And that maybe that's why you get 1,000 people. I mean, if you don't even know how to define it, then everyone could perceive that they were abused if they don't even know what the definition is. We'll continue. In some areas, the use of the term is generally accepted, said Humphreys. In others, it is questioned, and yet in others, it has raised anxiety and concerns. While there remains no legal definition of spiritual abuse, in 2018, a Church of England vicar was the first to be found guilty of it for his inappropriate actions against a teenage boy. This case and that of Timmis have caused consternation over where to draw the line between exhortation and coercion, between a challenging message and a toxic culture of control. All right, so now there's that was a challenging message. No, that's a toxic culture of control. That's a toxic culture of control. You're trying to control me. Wow, what do you do in churches? Now, when I first became a pastor, I was challenged. Well, don't we need a membership covenant, right? Where all the members sign a covenant. And if you look at a typical membership covenant, it'll have that, you promise to have family and private devotions. You promise to do this. You promise to attend church. You promise to do this. And I was like, absolutely not. We're not going to have a church covenant because first, that's very controlling. But second, if everyone signs the covenant, then you're opening all these people to some kind of form of church discipline if they don't fulfill the obligations of said covenant. And I'm like, no, I'm not going, no, I'm not going to do that. But I have been in churches where, yes, there's like, if you're going to be a member of this church, you will do this, you will do this, you won't do this, you won't do that. I've seen a lot of churches where there's lots of membership qualifications and requirements. So they're just talking about from a message, not even from a controlling aspect like church policy. They're talking that a message, there's a, is it a challenging message, or is it what did they call it? They use the word toxic, toxic culture of control. I mean, a challenging message can become a toxic culture of control. I think that would have to get to policy of the church. And I want you to please note how the perception here can be really, this is so crazy about how it works in the minds of church members. If you've been a pastor, you realize this. It's crazy how it works. You'll have someone, you'll be in some churches, if you miss church, you will get a phone call or you will get a visit saying, hey, we missed you on Sunday. Is everything okay? Now that comes across as they're caring, but you can perceive it as, so if I miss church, someone's going to knock on my door. If I miss church, someone's going to call my house. Some people will perceive that as harassment. Some people will perceive that as controlling. Some people will see that as a toxic culture of control. Some people may even call that spiritual abuse. Others, though, if you don't call and you don't show up, they didn't care. They didn't care. They didn't care about me. They didn't show up. They didn't check on me. They didn't care about me. Well, so sometimes as a church, you can't win. If you call and check up, you're harassing me. If you don't call and check up, you didn't care about me. What do you do? What do you do? Some churches make it very difficult for you to leave the church. Hey, I'm leaving the church. Well, we need to have a meeting. And you have a meeting, you get called in. What is your biblical justification for leaving the church? Well, brother, sister, that's not, you're misinterpreting that scripture. This church is not guilty of doing that. You have no biblical grounds to leave this church. So if you leave this church and your previous church contacts us, we're not going to send your member letter. We're not going to give we're not going to agree that you should be leaving because you're leaving this church on unbiblical grounds. I've seen churches do that. Now, other churches are just like, if you want to leave, you can leave. Then they're like, well, because they don't care about me and they did nothing to keep me here. Like, sometimes you cannot win. When is it controlling? When is it not controlling? A lot of that comes down to the perception of the person. So sometimes the lack of getting involved in people's lives, you get accused of not caring. Sometimes when you try to get all involved in everyone's business, now you're controlling and you're being a tyrant and you're trying to put me, basically a slave of your church. And you're like, okay, well, what can you do? So this is just talking, this is interesting language being used here. Let's continue. Oakley and Humphreys, who recently published Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse, Creating Healthy Christian Cultures, define spiritual abuse as. All right, now, they published Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse. Let me do something really quick. Yes, okay, it's a book. All right, here it is. It is a book. Wow. It looks like there's a lot of books on this kind of subject. Okay, so the name of the book is Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse, Creating Healthy Christian Cultures. It is $8.49 for the Kindle, $13.95 for paperback. They have used copies for $10. It's 192 pages, so $13 for 192 pages seems a little bit, but okay. Let me just read the description here. Let me read the description here of this book. Every time he wanted me to do something, he would quote scripture. I couldn't argue with scripture. It was like arguing with God. The term spiritual abuse is widely used across the Christian community, but what is it? Sometimes spiritual abuse involves leaders misusing their position, but ministers can also be the victims. Common factors include control through misuse of Scripture, claims to divine authority, pressure to conform and enforced accountability. Individuals may be isolated and compelled to secrecy and silence. Drawing on a combination of extensive research, individual testimonies, and years of hands-on experience, Lisa Oakley and Justin Humphreys describe clearly the nature of spiritual abuse and the best ways of countering it. Recovery is possible. So there is the name of this book. Let's go back to the article. So, you may want to read this book and get a better understanding of it. Pastors, ministers can even be victims of it. So, I mean, how does this work? Now, now make sure, I think we have to, before we continue back with the article, you see why this is such a slippery slope and why, again, you can hear it in my voice. I don't know what to say because I feel like this is a door that if we open, it's like Pandora's box. If we open this box, we're never going to get it closed again. All right? Because, I mean, this idea of controlling, this idea of manipulation, I want to make sure you understand the very nature of the way Christianity works. You have this very difficult relationship. Here's a pastor. I've got right here in my hand a Bible. I am to open this Bible, right? And in this Bible, I am to teach the Word of God. And I'm going to teach passages sometimes that speak directly at what people may be doing. And I'm going to have to preach it in a rebuking way. I'm going to have to reprove. I'm going to have to rebuke. And I'm going to have to say, this is what God's Word says. And if you're not doing this, you are in sin. Now that right there just is going to come across, this is going to be labeled by many as spiritual abuse. And some will say, well, it's how you say it. So now you have to worry about tone. You have to worry about inflection. You have to worry, and it's like, whoa. Where is this going? And then the pastor could say, hey, church members, you're abusing me. Is this going to turn into where everyone thinks everyone's being abused? And we're going to have a church filled with everyone believing that they're a victim of spiritual abuse. And so therefore you really can't say anything authoritative. You can't say anything dogmatic. You can't say anything in a rebuking way. You cannot condemn sin by name. You have to condemn sin in a very general way because you don't want anyone to feel abused. You don't want to feel a little bit uncomfortable. I mean, where is Christianity? What is Christianity going to look like if this idea continues? How is the church going to operate? This has implications I think every Christian should give some serious thought to. But let's go back to this article. So Oakley and Humphreys, who recently published, and we just looked at the book, Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse, Creating Healthy Christian Cultures, they define spiritual abuse as, and I quote, a form of emotional and psychological abuse characterized by a systematic pattern of coercive and controlling behavior in a religious context. End quote. So here is the definition they give. Let's read this definition again. Spiritual abuse is a form of emotional and psychological abuse characterized by a systematic pattern of coercive and controlling behavior in a religious context. Coercive and controlling behavior. Now, please note, if this enters into the home, every Christian parent, are you not offering some kind of coercive and controlling force to your children? No, you can't do that. No, you will do this. No, you won't do that. No, you need to do this. Oh, you read your Bible. Oh, that's a good thing. If you don't, oh, that's, whoa. How many Christian kids raised in a Christian home are going to start yelling that they were spiritually abused as children? And the name of that group was a little concerning. We talked about here, the original name of that group. They changed the name of their charity, but the original title was Church's Child Protection Advisory Service. That seemed to really put the emphasis on children. I'm going to take a drink of water here. I mean, Now, again, that's in the UK. I don't know. In America, obviously there's books written on this. There's lots of articles. I did a Google search. There's all kinds of articles. 10 ways to identify an abusive church, 10 ways to identify an abusive ministry. And you're like, wow. And you look at some of them and you're like, what does that mean? I mean, some of them almost implied, like I think one of the signs in one of the articles I read, independent. So in other words, an independent church could be a source of spiritual abuse because it's not a part of a larger hierarchy so that they can be controlled. Okay, well, are you telling me in churches where there is a hierarchy of control that you're going to stop abuse? The Catholic Church has one of the most outlined hierarchy. You've got bishops, cardinals, magisterium. You've got all kinds of offices. You've got synods. You've got bishops. I don't know how much more of a structure you can get. And you had children being sexually abused all over the world. So independent church, you could be spiritually abusive. So even with, a denomination could become abusive. I don't understand how the independent thing, there's always a move to condemn independent churches, but yeah. And then while you're condemning independent churches, then there's always these big fights that's like happening right now in the Southern Baptist Convention. Like there's going to be this, you had the Methodist Church that's, splitting. You have the Southern Baptist. There's these big fights happening within there. Some churches are leaving the Southern Baptist Convention. So even within denominations, can an independent church be abusive? I guess it could. Be. But so could a church that belongs to a denomination. And within the Southern Baptists, they're all autonomous anyway. So what does that even, I don't know. So, yeah, there's discussion about it in America, but in the UK, it seems to be going a little bit further than a discussion. But let's get back to the article and finish this up. And again, that definition seems, read that definition again. Defines spiritual abuse as a form of emotional and psychological abuse characterized by a systematic pattern of coercive and controlling behavior in a religious context. For the author, spiritual abuse adds an additional layer to an abusive experience when it is grounded and justified with a level of spirituality, said Humphreys. Now, that is true. I have to agree there. One of the things that can happen in a church is whenever a church does anything, they justify it spiritually. You have churches that will have, crazy things happening in the sanctuary. They turn it into a 3-ring circus. To me, it's an absolute joke. Bring in the clowns, bring in the elephants, a rock concert. You can have a pastor rappelling from the ceiling. You can just crazy stuff, and it's a joke. And then you condemn them for it. And they're like, hey, we care about the lost. We care about evangelism. And so they justify their behavior. You have churches, we're going to get together for this meal, and we're going to get together for this activity. And you're like, when was the church supposed to entertain people and stuff people's faces with physical food? Didn't Paul tell everyone to go home because don't they have a house to eat in? But they're supposed to come to church for their spiritual food, not for physical food. Didn't Paul say that to the church of Corinth? And you'll get, hey, you don't love people. This is fellowship. Throw in the word fellowship, and you can justify everything as a spiritual exercise. And guess what happens? And you talk about coercive and controlling. I experienced this. And almost all the churches I ever went to, they always had all these activities. Church picnic, fellowship this, fellowship that, get together for this, get together for that, get together. And you can say that I'm antisocial. You can condemn me to the 18th level of hell. But I would go to these activities. Didn't really have anything in common with anyone. Nobody was talking scripture. No one was talking sermons. No one was talking theology, talking about the weather and whatever, hunting, trucks, I don't know, stuff no one wanted to talk about the things I was interested in. Hey, what book did you read this week? Oh, you didn't read a book. Hey, what sermons? Oh, you didn't listen to any sermons. Hey, what scripture? Okay, you don't want to talk scripture. Hey, how about music? You don't want to talk music. Hey, okay. So I just didn't want to go. And guess what I would be told? If you don't go, you don't love Christians. And if you don't love Christians, you know what that means. You're not saved. And so is that not coercive and controlling? I had to go to prove that I was a Christian. I had to go to be spiritual, because if I didn't want to go, I wasn't spiritual. I wasn't godly. See, the godly people who wanted to go have a picnic, those are the godly people. If I don't want to go, if I wanted to just hang out by myself, I'm not godly. Or if I did have to go, I'd be sitting there with a book, reading a book. Oh, no, you need to participate. You need to talk. Okay. Now, again, you may have I think, again, that doesn't allow people to be themselves. That tries to isn't that controlling and coercive? Now, is that spiritual abuse? Was I a victim of spiritual abuse? Sometimes the church is not good at allowing people to be who they are. Within reason, you can't justify sin. But see, we always justify our actions as being spiritual. We can take literally getting together to eat food and turn it into that it's a spiritual exercise that true Christians will show up to. And if you don't want to show up to, you're not a Christian. That's literally what happens. So I agree that one of the things that makes so-called spiritual abuse so bad is because, there's spiritual justification for the behavior. We justify every behavior. Doesn't matter what it is. We can justify it. Oh, did you hear what so-and-so did? Did you hear what I'm going to gossip. I'm going to slander. I'm going to throw them under the bus. I'm going to expose them and I'm going to destroy their life. But I'm doing so because I want people to pray for you. Yeah. But we'll spiritually justify it. Yeah, the church is great at spiritually justifying any kind of behavior. So yeah, I agree that happens. But does it reach the level of, do we call it spiritual abuse and create a category? And then what happens to all the people who are guilty or who are victims of it? Should those pastors who did that to me, should they have been fired? So for the author, spiritual abuse adds an additional layer to an abusive experience when it is grounded and justified with the level of spirituality. However, critics of the term argue that there is no need to add subsections to the already accepted categories of abuse: sexual, physical, emotional, and neglect. Lee Gattis, director of the Church Society, wrote that the accuracy of the term is debatable and that perhaps it can serve as an umbrella term for other forms of abuse, but it is not its own distinct form of abuse. So others are going, hey, this is not its own distinct form of abuse. If it's going to be abuse, it falls into those other categories, all right, which are, let me go through those again, sexual, physical, emotional, and neglect. All right. In fact, let me go back here. To be fair, Oakley said that while she initially argued for spiritual abuse to be a separate category, she has now come to a point where she believes the evidence suggests it is a form of psychological and emotional abuse, being evidenced by a systematic pattern of coercive and controlling behavior. Well, okay, she doesn't want to call it spiritual abuse, but she's using basically the same definition that the people who call it spiritual abuse gave it. Coercive, controlling behavior, coercive, controlling behavior, coercive, controlling behavior, coercive, controlling behavior. I mean, you can, that definition leaves an opening that you could drive, 14 semi-trucks through. I mean, you could drive anything into that definition and make it fit. Let's see what else they have to say here. There is also a fear that such specific terminology might spiritualize criminal offense that are considered inappropriate in every context, not only within confines of a religious community, said David Hilborn, chair of the Theological Advisory Group of the UK Evangelical Alliance. In a 2018 report, Hilborn wrote that the term was so ambivalent and that there is nothing substantively or categorically distinct about spiritual abuse when compared to legal understandings of emotional and psychological abuse. So there's nothing of substance, or there's nothing categorically distinct with the term spiritual abuse. So what they're trying to say is that the spiritual abuse really just fits into what we've already labeled abuse in other contexts. So why create a new subcategory? All right, I guess we could have this debate. While emphasizing that the Evangelical Alliance takes all forms of abuse in the church seriously, he said, we don't want offenses committed specifically by pastors or elders to be basically put into a category by a language which can only apply to those who are spiritual, however spiritual is defined. For Hilborn, this raises the specter of attacks on religious freedom. Now, that's what I was concerned with. This could turn into religious freedom, going after, hey, no, you can't preach that. No, you can't teach that. No, you can't do that as a church. That's spiritual abuse. This could become something that could be used by government to control what the church does. Giving spiritual abuse a status as a criminal offense. Now, see, this is where we really get down to it. Giving spiritual abuse a status as a criminal offense could specifically target religious people on the basis of their faith, and that is deeply problematic. Yeah, you think? If spiritual abuse becomes a subcategory and it becomes a criminal offense, then I want you to hear this. It would be a criminal offense so that churches could be, prosecuted. You could call it a form of persecution. They would be prosecuted. And please note, spiritual abuse then could be something a parent could be charged with. That's what I was worried about when I first started talking, and that's why I was trying to be so careful. And ultimately, I wanted the article to lead us right to the subject. The article led us right there. Now, these people are involved with this whole debate. These people are involved with it, and they're like, hey, we don't want this to become a criminal offense. But I bet you there are others who want it labeled as a subcategory and make it a criminal offense. And once you do that, I don't know how the church operates. I don't know how because anyone could throw out an accusation. I was spiritually abused. I went to this church on Sunday. Now, listen to me. Listen to me carefully. Now, come on. This is 2020. We got to let's really get now. Now, let's get blunt. Let's really get down to it now. You ready? All right. You're sitting in a church. Visitor walks in. The pastor's up there preaching, and he preaches a hard sermon against homosexuality. He calls it a sin. Says it's a sin that is condemned by God and that homosexuals will be judged. He goes after the whole idea of gender being, fluid, and that you can define your own gender, that no, we were created by God, male and female, and that and he talks about gender, and he goes after the LGBTQ movement. He goes after it all. And then the visitor, you look over and you see that the visitor is getting really mad, getting really upset. And as soon as the sermon is over, the visitor just leaves, doesn't say a word. And then the next day, you get a phone call from government officials that someone was at your church on Sunday, and they are saying that they were spiritually abused because they are a homosexual or they are transgender. Now, is that too far-fetched? Now, it may be far-fetched here in the United States of America. Is that too far-fetched in the United Kingdom? I don't think that's too far-fetched. And they could claim spiritual abuse. And what happens when your child, 14, 15, and they decide, I'm going to the authorities because I'm being spiritually abused in this home. They're making me go to church. They're telling me that this behavior is sinful. They're telling me that sleeping with my girlfriend is a sin. They're telling me that homosexuality is a sin. They're spiritually abusing me. They're using coercive and controlling methods yeah. Now this takes a whole different whole thing. So let me go back and read that paragraph again. Giving spiritual abuse a status as a criminal offense could specifically target religious people on the basis of their faith, and that is deeply problematic. Although Oakley and Humphreys are not wed to the terminology, they both affirm that spiritual abuse is an appropriate term because it identifies the particularities of abuse used with direct reference to sacred text or operating on behalf of a divine entity. Referencing the specificity of domestic abuse as a clear example of coercive, controlling, and manipulative behavior in an intimate or family relationship, Humphrey said that the concept of spiritual abuse speaks directly to one's soul and one being in a way that we just don't see in any other context. All right? So they're saying that when domestic abuse, I guess this is what they're arguing in that paragraph, domestic abuse is a very specific form of abuse. It is labeled, it is distinct because it's a clear example of a coercive, controlling, and manipulative behavior in the intimate intimate or family relationship. So therefore, that's why it has its own special designation as domestic abuse, because it's very specific. And what they're arguing is that spiritual abuse is very specific because it speaks directly to one's soul and one's being in a way that we just don't see in any other context. Well, there is some argument there. Despite the debate, the term has cultural purchase. On various websites, social media platforms, and online forums, victims and survivors share their stories using the language of spiritual abuse. Individuals like Jody Stanley, whose father abused multiple members of his church and family, found that the term spoke to her own trauma. She said that the church's lack of discernment on issues like spiritual abuse and disdain for acknowledging them creates a noxious environment where suffering like hers can readily occur. Now, it would be interesting to know exactly what happened in her church. What trauma did she experience? All right, and please note, it was her father, or Jody Stanley, or his, whose father abused multiple members of his church. Okay, yeah, she said. Okay, so Jody's the female, and it was her father who abused multiple members of her church. So she was raised in a pastor's home, it sounds like, and she's saying she was traumatized and she experienced spiritual abuse. I'm telling you, it will be lots of kids raised in Christian homes that will start using this terminology. Although there are no firm numbers, Kay Bruner, a licensed professional counselor working mostly with Christians in ministry, said spiritual abuse, now listen, is absolutely endemic. Lewis Gibson, who started the website Spiritual Abuse Org in 1997, believes it is on the rise. She said there are far too many who consider themselves a minister but are busy building little kingdoms of themselves while they trample on the people around them. All right? So, in fact, let me do something really quick. I'm going to look something up because I want to make 100% sure as we try to figure this out together. All right, endemic, I wanted to make sure the definition of endemic, of a disease or condition regularly found among particular people or in a certain area. All right, so what that one person is saying, I got all kinds of articles here about spiritual abuse. What that Kay Bruner, a licensed professional counselor working mostly with Christians in ministry, spiritual abuse then is, and let me go back to the definition, spiritual abuse is regularly found, particularly among particular people or in a certain area. So among Christians, spiritual abuse is regularly found. That's the argument that person is making. And it's regularly found amongst Christians, spiritual abuses. So on a normal basis, you're going to find Christians who have been spiritually abused. So this person who started the website spiritualabuse.org in 1997. So there was a website in 1997 dealing with spiritual abuse. And again, I've never spoken much about this. I've never given this a lot of consideration and thought. And I try to be right on top of things, and this is just a subject that I just never gave much consideration to, you know. And I think, to be fair, in the 1990s, now I won't tell my story, but in the 1990s, I was in an independent fundamental Baptist church, and let's just say that situation went from bad to worse to absolutely unbelievable. I could write a book about what happened. And I did speak to some other pastors and other people from other churches trying to get advice, trying to figure out exactly what to do. And I was told that, hey, that sounds like an abusive church. That sounds like an abusive church. So I probably used the terminology maybe describing that situation that I don't know if I called it spiritual abuse, but I may have referred to it as an abusive church. This is crazy because it was insane. And you talk about controlling, you talk about coercion, you talk about manipulation, you talk about setting someone up, you talk about threatening to, that I was a bug that they were going to squash. And telling someone else that, and then that person comes and warns me that it's going to happen. I get called into the office. I get accused of all kinds of things, and basically they're going to destroy me. I get upset, and then they have some secret meeting that I'm not even a part of, where the church meets, and everyone in the church is told to break fellowship with me. And then the person who knew that I was being set up would not speak up for my defense. Oh man, the story is insane. Everything that went down in that church. So that would be coercive, controlling. Again, I was told that it was abusive. I was pretty much told that in that kind of church you can't win. But yeah, and today's culture, that would definitely have been spiritual abuse. And it was abusive. There's no question about it. It was manipulative. It was evil. It was wrong. It was ungodly. I mean, I typically put it more in the terminology that it was ungodly. It was unscriptural. That's not the way you treat people. It's not the way you handle people. That's not the way a pastor is supposed to deal with people. Manipulation, secret meeting. I'm going to destroy this person. No. That's not what you do. That's not how it's supposed to be handled. And, yeah, I've been there, lived there. I got the t-shirt to prove it. Okay. And I do agree that there are many pastors who are building little kingdoms for themselves while they trample on people around them. But see, when I say that, when I talk about that, I mean this. You have this pastor who's a pastor of a church of 40, 50 people, and then he decides, peace, I'm out. I'm going to go find a bigger church. He goes on to a bigger church and then leaves that 40 and 50 people without a pastor, without a shepherd. And that to me is spiritual abuse. That's neglect. That's neglect, but you bring that up and everyone looks at you like you're crazy. No, a pastor shouldn't leave the church until he's found a suitable replacement for the church. And that's how it works in any place of business. You don't just leave. You find a replacement. That replacement is trained, and then there's a transition period. You don't have leadership just bye, peace, out. You have to have a transition process. There should be a transition process for every church. The pastor can't leave until he helps the church find a suitable replacement. Man, but no, I'm peace, I'm out. And God called you to a church of 400 people in Florida. Yeah. Isn't that interesting how that works? All right. And there's so much to this article. Yeah, let's continue. Man, there's just so much here to unpack. And 31/8, remember that's their new name for this charity, I guess they call themselves. And 31/8 statement on this issue, Humphrey said that while holding a theological position is not in itself inherently spiritually abusive, the misuse of Scripture, applied theology, and doctrine is often a component of spiritual abusive behavior. Wow, that is scary. That is scary. The misuse of Scripture. Now, come on. Who gets to define when you're misusing it? Who gets to define it? And I bet you a theological position. They may not say it may not be inherently spiritual abuse. Yeah, I bet you a theological position that believes in an eternal hell and that homosexuality is a sin. Yeah, I bet you will be considered spiritual abuse in 2020 by many. Let's continue. What we say is that we are talking about emotional, psychological abuse that involves systematic patterns that deny choice, freedom, or the ability to disagree. That deny choice, freedom, or the ability to disagree. Now, I want you to understand this. What do you mean by the ability to disagree? If you have a church that has a theological confession of faith, a doctrinal confession of faith, and someone comes along in the church and says, I don't agree with point A, B, C, and D, well, I'm sorry, you can't be a member here, or that you are a member, you need to leave. Well, is that denying their freedom of church and their ability to disagree? There's many churches who hold people to a doctrinal theological standard. Hey, here's our confession of faith. If you're going to be a member, you have to submit to this. And if you no longer believe this, you may have to leave unless you can sit there and be quiet and not try to change other people's minds, but that rarely happens. Once a person comes to a new theological understanding, the first thing they do is they start calling people in the church and trying to meet with them to change their mind to a theological position that's contrary to the church, which usually leads to church splits, which to me is spiritual abuse to the pastor because that's wrong. Just pack up and leave and don't try to take half the church with you. All right. Yeah, this article goes on. I mean, I can't read all of this. I cannot. We've already We've been on the air for 1 hour and 3 minutes, so I cannot read all of this. So and I even had more articles. I wanted to get to all the articles. I've got like 5 articles on this subject. And 2 of the articles are linked up from that article. And then I did a search and I found 10 signs of an abusive church. In fact, I'll just read those really quick to you. Let me just find them really quick. Ten signs of an abusive church. 10 signs of an abusive church. And this is how this article begins. Church often brings Elizabeth Esther to a panic attack. The familiar faces, the rich-colored wood, the cadence of the hymns might seem innocuous to the average churchgoer, but those invasive eyes, confining walls, and songs of condemnation hit her hard from the past. They hurt her because of where she'd been. Esther grew up in a homegrown fundamentalist church where she learned to distrust herself, stockpile for the apocalypse, and nothing about forgiveness. Now that she's free, she's learning to trust God, and she wants to help others who may be caught up in a legalistic and abusive church environment. In a trending blog post, she lists the top 10 warning signs that we should watch for. All right. Number 1, personality-centric. So the first thing you look for is a personality-centric church, basically where the pastor's charming, charismatic, intense, persuasive, intelligent personality holds unquestioned sway over his or her congregation. He or she is treated like a celebrity. Okay, well, give me a break. Isn't that every mega church in America? They're clearly personality-centric. Listen, I will say every church on the planet is personality-centric. You know why? When pastor leaves, church members leave because they were there for that person. They were there because they like that person's preaching. They like that person's personality. There was something about that that's typically personality-centric in some way, shape, or form. At least to some level, it's personality-centric. But in mega churches, pastors are treated like rock stars. Give me a break. The Shepherds Conference is going on right now. Those pastors who are preaching at the Shepherds Conference are treated like rock stars. People are taking pictures of them as they're preaching on their phones and posting them on social media. They want to meet them. They want to shake their hands. They want to get a picture with them. They want to get their autograph. Give me a break. Christianity has always had its celebrities. It always has had its celebrities. That's why if there wasn't a celebrity culture within Christianity, you wouldn't have conferences where people pay $300, $400, $500, $600 to get in to hear pastors preach. Give me a break. If that's spiritual abuse or an abusive church, half of Christianity is guilty of that. Yeah. Now I know what they're saying. That, yeah, you can have someone who, because of their celebrity status, they can get away with murder. I understand that. Well, some people believe that a pastor who doesn't have any celebrity can get away with murder. Okay? They get away with what the church allows them to supposedly get away with. Or the church can sit there and say, you can't mess up because if you mess up, we're going to fire you. But then they don't hold themselves to the same standard they hold the pastor to. Right? I mean, come on. There's got to be... How do you even deal with that? The rest of our points are operates independently. There you go. If a church operates independently. So that goes after every independent church. After every independent church. Engulfment, members only. What does that mean? Busyness, a focus on activities. All right, well, I can't. That's one thing I can't be accused of. My church is independent. I definitely am not a celebrity, so I don't have any celebrity status. Tell them, I have no sway over the members of my church. They will disagree with me at the drop of a hat, okay? So clearly I have no sway. Busyness, we don't have activities, so I don't have. Stalking, keeping tabs on members. Well, I do keep tabs on all the members. I have their GPS location. I know exactly what they're doing. No, I do not. Coded language, members-only jargon. Unrealistic promises, unhealthy focus on wealth and blessing. Well, we don't have that. Courting rituals, dating by approval only. Okay, I've never talked to the young people about who they can date. Now there is a biblical passage that they are not to date unbelievers. I wonder if that falls into there. Shunning, not accepting those who leave or are outside the church. The end justifies the mean. Purity of doctrine over love. Wow, that sounds ambiguous. Shouldn't we care about doctrine and truth? I mean, it doesn't love the truth. I mean, just see whenever anyone creates a list like this, it's so vague that you can almost make every church guilty of spiritual abuse. That's what it's coming to. You're going to have any person who had a bad experience, or now they're going to say spiritually abusive church, spiritually abusive pastor, spiritual abusive congregation, spiritually abusive. I was spiritually abused. And they can find a list somewhere on the internet that says, see, you're guilty of these things. All right, we'll end with this. I know we've spent a long time on this. It's crazy because all right, let's do this. We'll try to wrap this up. I know members of my church are laughing because whenever I say we're going to wrap this up, 3 hours later, I'm still talking. But I'm going to try to do this. I need to take a drink of water. 1 second. All right. Let's do this. Spiritual abuse. Okay, I'm going to say this. Spiritual abuse is something that all Christians should be concerned about and try to understand. I think it is a subject that we should go, okay, we don't want to be abusive. We want to be biblical. We want to preach against sin. We want reproof, rebuke. We want to be convicted. We want that, but we don't want it to slide into abuse. So it's something that we want to at least be concerned with, try to look out for. So spiritual abuse is something every Christian in every church should at least be concerned about. Number two, however, we need a definition that makes some kinds of sense. We need an actual definition of what it is. And here's what I would suggest. So number one, it's something we should be concerned about. Number two, I'll do it this way. Number two, we need a definition. We need a definition of some sort. And this will lead me to number three. I think the definition that we should look for is this, that the church and the pastor and the church members should strive to operate and conduct themselves biblically. The Bible has to be the thing that structures this. The Bible has to be the thing. The Bible has to be the thing that we look to say, does the Bible allow this? Does the Bible condemn this? We have to look to scriptures first, right? I mean, that has to be the way the church operates. Where are we going to get the definition from? A psychologist? Some professor at some university? And they become the Pope that says, this is spiritual abuse. If you do this, you're guilty. Well, they just hand down the definition from on high. Shouldn't the church has to operate biblically. Even if the culture says it's spiritual abuse, we still, again, if you're a pastor and you're teaching the young people, look, you cannot be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. So don't date an unbeliever. Christian parents, if your teenager claims to be a Christian, now this is where I would stress, if they claim to be a Christian, you've got to help them not date an unbeliever. Because that's scripturally wrong. They're being unequally yoked with an unbeliever. Is that spiritual abuse? Now, again, if your teenager doesn't claim to be a Christian, then I don't know why you're trying to force them to date a Christian, because that's unfair to the Christian that your pagan kid is dating. Okay, so we have to have balance there. But is that spiritual abuse? Now, I believe it can be done in a spiritually abusive way, where you are controlling and you are getting involved in a situation. You've got to also allow people to grow and to fall and to be, and hopefully to be, picked back up, to be restored. I mean, we have to also allow people to live their lives, and there's going to be sin and there's going to be failure. You can't, control every move. You've got to give people that freedom to mess up and to fall and to show grace and to show forgiveness. Now, there's sometimes, how do you operate church discipline in the world in a world where spiritual abuse is a thing? How does that work? So let's go through these again. Number one, it's a situation we should be concerned with. Number two, we need a definition. Number three, I believe the definition has to be shaped from a scriptural understanding of what the church can and the church cannot do. But I'll be honest, if you look at what churches do now, Christians can't even agree on what a church can and cannot do. I mean, I would take from Paul, hey, Paul tells them when they were abusing the Lord's Supper, hey, don't you have a house to eat in? Go eat at home. I would say then that should just stop all the nonsense with all the church potlucks and all of that. But people say, that's crazy. That's not what Paul meant. Paul just meant go home and eat. Don't. Yeah, well, Paul said go home and eat. Don't you have houses? Come to church for the Lord's Supper, not to stuff your face with food. But I would be told, nope, that's a wrong application. So we couldn't even agree on that. I think all the fun, food, and activities don't belong in the church. Church is not mandated to entertain people. It's to equip saints. Well, some people say that's spiritually abusive. Yeah, we've got to use a biblical mandate, but we can't even agree on the biblical mandate. So it's a subject we have to be concerned about. We need a definition. Number 3, we have to try to just make the Bible, figure out from the Bible our definition. But here is the point I want to really end with. Right? And this is where I really want to end. This is a subject that just screams to me, danger, 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 danger. Danger, danger, danger. I could sound like the robot on Lost in Space, okay? This just sounds like danger. Because this sounds like, whoa, spiritual abuse. Let's make it a subcategory and let's make it a criminal offense. Let's make it something that can be punished by law. That opens the door for the Child Protective Services here in the United States, CPS to get involved in. Schools to get involved in. Your child is at school saying something about what he can or cannot do because he's raised in a Christian home, and the teacher's like, oh, that's spiritual abuse. I'm going to report that to the authorities. Churches, church members who become upset and get mad and leave. They want to accuse the church of spiritual abuse, and the authorities get involved. This has danger written all over it. And as a culture that is moving further and further away from Christianity, they don't have even a theological framework to understand it. So they hear things that happen in the church. They have not been raised in the church. They don't have any understanding of Scripture. Everything will sound like spiritual abuse to people who have no understanding of Christianity or the Bible. They will perceive everything as spiritual abuse. Now, again, I'm not saying this is going to happen tomorrow. I'm not going to say this is happening next week. I'm not going to say this is happening next year. I'm saying this is something that we have to pay attention to. All right, I'll stop right there. We have gone for how long? 1 hour and 16 minutes, all off one article. We didn't even get to the other 4 articles. I didn't even get to the scripture that I have here. I have a scripture here in 1 Peter about pastors not, and how they should serve the Christians and serve the church and feed the flock and some other things and not lording that over them. What does that mean? We're going to look up the Greek. We're going to do a kind of a little scriptural study on that, but obviously we don't have time to do everything. Like I said, this is to introduce the subject, throw it out there. And then maybe at some point we'll come back to it. I have never addressed this in any I've not spent much time on it. And I listen to a lot of Christian programming, and I haven't heard a lot of discussion about it. I think there's a certain kind of there's a certain culture within Christianity, a subculture within Christianity that may tend to be maybe a little bit more liberal, a little bit more progressive, where this is an issue. And I think in more of the conservative churches, they just discount it. I don't want it to be one of the conservative churches that discount it. We need to know what it is. We need to care about it, but we need to define it. We need to try to come up with a biblical understanding of how the church should operate. Let me say it again. But this is dangerous. This is dangerous. I am telling you, it's dangerous. And we'll have to see how it plays out in the UK. I think the UK is going to be where we are going to see it play out first. And then I can imagine states like California. Man, you can imagine a lot of states in America adopting similar principles. And then the federal government has to step in, and the constitutional rights of the freedom of religion. How does this all play out? Man, well, call me up in 6 years. Call me up in 5 years, probably 5 years. Call me up in 5 years. Let's see where we are as Christians and as churches in 5 years. All right, we'll stop right there. If you have comments or feedback, please email me at newsif@yahoo.com. newsif@yahoo.com. I apologize. I was struggling to even how to approach this, but there was a method to my madness. I purposely knew that as soon as I hit the go live button, I was going to stumble a little bit. I knew I was going to struggle a little bit, but I want you to feel that struggle. I wanted it to be a mirror of hopefully the internal struggle you're going to have. Well, we can't just throw out the idea of spiritual abuse. However, I don't want my kids accusing me of spiritual abuse. Well, wait a minute. Did I abuse my kids spiritually? Wait, is my church spiritually abusive? Wait, am I abusing my pastor? Wait, how do we define this? I want you to feel that and struggle with it. Now, some of you may have read all kinds of books on this. You're well versed in this. You're an expert on this. Email us and help us understand. Help us understand. But for the rest of us, I think we're going to have a hard time going, that sounds like everyday Christianity is spiritually abusive. All right, we'll stop there. Everyone have a great day. Thank you for listening to this live broadcast coming to you live from Victory Baptist Church. This has been a live broadcast of the Theology Central podcast, where we try to make theology central to your everyday life. God bless.